my lesson today will be for the grade 12s, and the topic that I will be addressing today with the grade 12s is the causes of inflation. Thank you and welcome. Now, before you, you've been given a balloon, each of you. Now, this is what I want you to do to the balloon. I want you to blow air into the balloon, right? Now, what you've just done, you have inflated the balloon. Now, now I want you to tie that balloon after you have blown air into it. Now, you have just inflated the balloon. That is, in other words, you have expanded the balloon. This relates to inflation of prices, which means it's an increase of prices. Now, secondly, I want you now to untie the balloon and remove the air out of the balloon. Now, the result of that will lead to the shrinkage of the balloon or the contraction of the balloon. As the balloon contracts, that means that process is deflation. Right. Now, because I said we are going to look at the causes of inflation today, this is now what I want you to do. I want you to look at the next graph and tell me about the trend, the current inflation trend in South Africa. This is the graph. Now, I want you to tell me what is happening in this graph. What kind of trend are you picking up from this graph in South Africa? Now, we are going to look at the causes of inflation. There are various factors that cause inflation in the economy, but for our purpose today, we are going to concentrate on two main causes of inflation, and namely the demand pull inflation, and the second one is cost push inflation. Now, before we go on, I want us to look at the next activity now. Here I've got a worksheet before you. This worksheet consists of column A and column B. Now, I want you to choose a description in column B that matches the concept or the term in column A. There's an activity that you will do and we'll correct it later. Now, as we come into the content of the day, the causes of inflation, it is very important for us to understand the concepts first. I'm going to explain some of the concepts to you. Most of these concepts, you saw them in your worksheet there. Now, let's start with inflation. I know this has been dealt with previously. What is inflation? Inflation is a sustained and significant increase in the general price level over a period of time. And we know that inflation, as the general price level increases, it leads to a decrease in the purchasing power or the buying power of money. What you've done to the balloon, you've blown air into the balloon, that led to the expansion of the balloon. So that can be related to an increase in the prices of goods and services in the economy. So that is inflation. We all know what inflation is. Now, the next concept that I want to explain that we are going to come into contact with is demand pull. What is demand pull inflation? This type of inflation occurs when the aggregate demand for goods and services in the economy is actually more than the supply of those goods and services in the economy. So it occurs when the aggregate demand is actually bigger than the supply. That is your aggregate, that is your demand pull inflation. Now, what about cost push inflation? That's another concept that I need to explain. Cost push inflation, this one occurs when there is an increase in the general price level, because remember that's inflation, an increase in the general price level. And now this increase in the general price level, it is caused by an increase in the cost of production. Right. That is cost push inflation. Now let's look at the next concept, which is aggregate demand. Aggregate demand, this is the total demand for goods and services in the economy at a given period of time. That is the aggregate demand. In the graph, it will be indicated as AD. Now, the next concept that I want to explain is aggregate supply. What is aggregate supply? It is the total supply of goods and services in the economy also at a given period of time. You know, in economics, all our activities are confined to a period of time, right? That is aggregate supply. Now let's look at the next concept. The next concept is inflation targeting. You might have heard this concept being referred to in the media, on TV, on radio. Now what is that? Inflation targeting. This is an economic monetary policy, which means it is a policy that is implemented by the monetary authority, that is the South African Reserve Bank, in which the central bank, which is the authority, the monetary authority in the country, sets a preferred rate of inflation, and then they try to attempt or direct the economy or the actual inflation towards the target. We know what the target inflation target in South Africa is. It's between 3% to 6%. So that is the inflation targeting policy. The next concept that I want us to look at is the monetary policy. When we talk about monetary policy, this is deliberate actions by the monetary authority again. And by monetary authority again, we refer to the South African Reserve Bank as well as the Monetary Policy Committee, normally referred to as the MPC. They try to influence the quantity of money, the money that circulates within the economy, through interest rates. And the main aim of the monetary policy is actually to try to stabilize the prices in the economy, coupled with inflation targeting. We've just defined what inflation targeting is. And then one important concept that I think we all need to understand is consumption. Consumption in economics, we're actually referring to the usage of goods and services to satisfy wants. That is consumption. And then lastly, because we are going to encounter this concept, depreciation of the currency, but I want to explain the concept depreciation. You know, depreciation actually means when it actually means that the lose of when something loses value. Like when we say depreciation of the rand, we're actually saying that the rand loses value. That is depreciation. Now, in this case, it will be when the rand loses value as a result of cost-push inflation. We'll look at that. Now, let's continue to look at the next slide. We are going to look at the cause of inflation now. I said specifically today we are going to look at those two main causes, demand pull and cost-push inflation. Now, let's start with demand pull inflation. Now, with demand pull inflation, it happens when the aggregate demand increases faster than aggregate supply, right? When the AD is bigger than the AS in the graph. It will be explained in the graph later, right? In other words, what happens when we talk about demand pull inflation, we are actually referring to the rise in the prices of goods and services as a result of the demand side factors. So the demand factors are the ones responsible for the increase in the general price level. That's why we talk of demand pull inflation. That was the explanation of the demand pull inflation. Now let's explain the cost push inflation quickly, like we did in the concepts when I was explaining the concepts. Now the cost push inflation, on the other hand, it is the increase in the general price level, which is caused by the factors of production. Alternatively, we can say the rise in price is caused by the supply side factors. Whereas when we talk about the demand pull inflation, the increase in price is caused by the demand side factors. Now, I also have another activity for you again. There's a worksheet again before you that shows the demand pull and the cost push graphs. Those two graphs, look at them. Now, this is what I want you to do. Number one, I want you to identify the differences between the two graphs and tell us what the differences are. And then secondly, I want you to answer this question: what do you think could be the factors that lead to an increase in aggregate demand in the demand pull inflation graph? And then the last question, I want you to give examples of factors that can lead to an increase in the cost of production. Right. Now let's get into the content and explain these two concepts fully. Demand pull inflation as well as cost push inflation. Now let's look at the demand pull inflation again. We said earlier that demand pull inflation occurs as a result of demand outpacing supply, or aggregate demand outpacing or growing faster than aggregate supply. But now, there's a graph that I'm going to show you. And in that graph, this is what happens. There's an increase in the aggregate demand, which is AD, which will shift to AD1, or which will shift from AD1, you see AD1 to AD2. And as aggregate demand shifts from AD1 to AD2, what happens to the general price level? The general price level there also increases from P1 to P2, right? In other words, as the aggregate demand increases from AD1 to AD2, from our graph here, it shows that the price will also shift from AD1, from P1 to P2, as the demand shifts to the right. Now, what I would like to emphasize there is that a further increase in the components of the aggregate demand will shift the aggregate demand to AD2 and to AD3 if there's a further shift. And as that further shift happens, the price will also move from P2 to P3. So that's how it happens. Every time when the demand curve shifts to the right, the prices will also increase. So that's why we say as the demand becomes bigger, it pulls the price upward. So that's what we mean by demand pull inflation. So the increase in the average price level is caused by an excess aggregate demand while supply remains unchanged. Right, that is the whole idea behind the demand pull inflation. Now, this is the graph that I'm talking about. You can follow from that graph. And now, let's look at the causes of demand pull inflation. These are the causes. Number one, we said the prices increase as a result of demand side factors. Now, which are those factors? Now, we're going to look at those factors individually. One of the factors is this one. It's the increase in household expenditure. From our GDP equation, it's the C, household consumption. So when there is an increase in the consumption of household, now what will lead to an increase in the consumption of household? It will be because individuals or members of the household have got more money to spend. Normally, it would be because they save less, or it would be because there's a reduction of taxes, or it will also be as a result of household having easy access to credit, or it will also mean that they can get loans easily. That's easy access to credit. Now, when that happens, it means households have got more money to spend. And as they have more money to spend, then they will demand more goods and services. And as a result, that demand shift will move or will shift to the right, and it will bring up the prices. So that's one. And then cause number two, it's increase in investment. Now, when we talk about investment, we're actually looking at the business side of the economy. When the business spends their money to buy buildings, to buy machinery, we call that investment expenditure. So this can also be one of the stimulators of the aggregate demand to increase. And when that happens, it will pull up the prices again. And then the third reason would be government expenditure. The government is also one of the participants in the economy. It is not only the business and the household who are participants. Now, as the government increases their spending, as the need arises, that also helps to push the aggregate demand to the right. And as that happens, you've seen in the graph that as the demand shifts from AD1 to AD2 and from AD2 to AD3, every time the price goes up. And that is also one of the causes of demand pull inflation. And then lastly, one of the demand factors that causes the demand to shift to the right, or to increase, in other words, because in the economy, we also have the foreign sector that takes part in our economy, where we exchange goods and services with other countries. Now, goods that we sell to other countries, they bring us earnings into the country. So that's why we refer here as export earnings, or export or services earnings. As we sell goods to other countries, we earn income for our economy. Now that can also push the demand to the right, because as more and more of our goods are demanded outside the borders of our economy, that pushes the demand curve, and that will also make the prices to be pulled up as the demand shifts to the right, or as the demand increases. So those are the demand factors that causes the demand pull inflation. Now, I want us now to look at the cost push inflation in detail. We have already explained what cost push inflation is. It's an inflation that is caused by an increase in any of the factors of production. Now, the cost push inflation, as you can see in this graph, it is reflected in an upward or the leftward shift of the aggregate supply to AS1 from AS. Now, an increase in the cost of production in a business can lead to an increase in the price level from P to P1, and the decrease in the quantity produced, and as well as the income. This is reflected in this graph that is on the screen. Every time when there is an increase in any of the factors of production within the business, what will happen? The producer will shift that cost to the consumer. And as a result, the supply curve will move backward or to the left. And as the supply curve shifts to the left, that's a decrease in supply, because it becomes expensive for the business to produce that kind of a product. And as that happens, what will happen? The price of the product will also increase. So this is an increase in the price that is pushed by the cost within the business. Right. I think that is very clear now. Now let's look at some of the factors that causes this cost push inflation. Cost push inflation is caused by a combination of various components of production cost. But I want us to focus on the following. These are the production costs. One of them is wages. You know, every business pays salaries, wages to its employees. Now, what can actually make wages to be increased is the activities of union. When they demand more wages or higher wages, it will actually cause the employer to pay them an increased wage. And what will happen? It means the employer will have to recover that cost somehow. So generally, the employer would increase his prices as a result of that. So wages is one of the causes, the supply side costs of increasing the prices and leading to cost push inflation. The second one would be the key inputs in the business or within the economy. Now, those key inputs, they will differ from business to business. Some businesses use inputs such as raw materials. So as the price or the cost of those key inputs increases, what will happen? It is natural that the business will also increase their prices to recover the more cost that they have incurred in order to get raw material to produce. Right, so that is the second one. The third one would be the exchange rate depreciation. Remember, we explained what depreciation is. When we're experiencing an exchange rate depreciation, it means that the currency or the currency of the country loses value as a result of demand and supply. Because in our country, we are using a free-floating kind of an exchange rate. So the exchange rate depreciation, when the rand becomes weaker against foreign currencies, that can also cause prices to rise. If we look, for instance, into our mining industries, our gold industry, our platinum industries, who are actually being favored when the rand becomes weak. And when the rand becomes strong, it's a disfavor for them. Right. So that is one of the factors that can cause an increase in the production cost within the business. Now, the next one would be increasing the profit margin. When a business increases their profit margin, say from 15% to 30%, that, of course, will also lead to an increase in their prices. They will have to push up their prices. And who's going to pay the price? The consumer. Right. So that is an increase in the prices, which is caused by an increase in the profit margin of the business. Right. And then the next factor would be productivity. When we try to increase productivity within the economy, what will happen? It means productivity actually refers to the relationship between an input and an output, right? If we are able to increase the output with the input that we have, then that is an increase in productivity. Now, when that happens, it means the prices of goods and services will also increase. And as the prices increases, you know what will happen? It's a price which increases, which is pushed by the cost within the business. And the last factor which causes cost push inflation here is natural disasters. Natural disasters, we refer here to disasters such as the one that we have experienced very lately in our country, drought. When there is drought, what happens? There are industries that are going to suffer, like your agricultural industry. It means the production of their output would be less because of drought. And what that means, it means the supply of agricultural products will be less, like your maize, your grain, your wheat. And if the supply is less, you know what's going to happen? The price is going to be pushed upwards. So this is also one of the typical example of factors that will push the cost upwards. So these are all the factors that causes cost push inflation. Right. Now, we have now looked at the two main causes of inflation, which is demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Now, as we conclude this lesson, there's an activity before you. This is our fifth activity. I want you to look at that. It's an extract on the South African inflation rate. I want you to study the extract, and then you answer these questions, the questions that follow that extract. This is the end of our lesson. Thank you very much.